Billionaire Wilton Phillips sat in first-class seat 4B of the transatlantic flight, his face pale with exhaustion and humiliation as his 6-month-old son, Kevin, screamed at a pitch that seemed to pierce straight through every noise-canceling headphone on the plane. For nearly 3 straight hours, every single passenger had been subjected to the relentless crying that no amount of wealth, power, or desperation could silence. Wilton had tried absolutely everything. He'd walked the aisles for 40 minutes straight, bouncing Kevin in his arms, offered 3 different bottle temperatures, changed diapers that didn't need changing, adjusted the cabin temperature using his phone app, and even tried playing white noise and lullabies at different volumes. Nothing worked. Kevin's face stayed bright red, his tiny fists clenched, his screams never losing intensity. If you're already hooked by this impossible situation, hit that subscribe button right now, because what happens next will absolutely change how you see kindness and genius. And drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see how global this community really is. Where are you watching from? Now, back to the story, because what this teenager does next is something nobody saw coming. The other first-class passengers were no longer hiding their anger. A woman in pearls in a designer suit named Anita Perez had already complained twice to the flight attendants, her voice dripping with contempt. "This is first class, not a daycare. Control your child or remove him from this section." A businessman named Desmond Rivas had threatened to sue the airline, mentioning his lawyers by name. Even the flight attendants had run out of suggestions, exchanging helpless looks every time they passed Wilton's row. The tension in the cabin was suffocating. Wilton Phillips, a man who commanded billion-dollar deals and tech summits with world leaders, felt tears stinging his own eyes. He was completely, utterly powerless. That's when something unthinkable happened. The blue curtain that separated first class from economy parted, and a teenage boy stepped through. He was tall and lean, a young black teenager who looked about 16 years old. He wore a faded red t-shirt with a small hole near the hem, jeans that had been repaired with patches on both knees, and carried a backpack that was literally held together with strips of duct tape across the straps. His presence in the first-class section immediately drew stares. Anita Perez physically pulled back in her seat. Desmond Rivas muttered just loud enough to be heard. "What is he doing up here?" The teenager's hands trembled slightly, but he walked directly to Wilton's seat with quiet dignity. His voice was soft, but somehow cut through Kevin's wails. "Excuse me, sir. May I try to help your son?" Wilton was so exhausted, so desperate, so completely defeated that he didn't even question why this stranger from economy class was offering help. He didn't wonder about protocol or propriety or what the other passengers might think. He simply looked into the teenager's eyes and saw something he couldn't quite name. No pity, something else. Recognition, maybe. Understanding. He nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Please." The moment the teenager's hands gently took Kevin from Wilton's arms, something miraculous happened. The screaming didn't stop immediately, but it changed. The teenager cradled Kevin against his chest at a very specific angle, his movements precise and confident. He began a rhythmic swaying motion, steady like a heartbeat, and hummed a low melody that seemed to vibrate through his chest. He adjusted Kevin's position slightly, applied gentle pressure to the baby's belly with his palm, and within 90 seconds, complete and absolute silence fell over the entire first-class cabin. Kevin's screams faded to whimpers, then to soft breathing, then to nothing. His tiny red face slowly relaxed. His eyes, which had been squeezed shut in distress for 3 hours, opened and focused on the teenager's face. For the first time since takeoff from Chicago, Kevin looked calm, peaceful, almost content. 200 passengers seemed to hold their breath at once. Jaws dropped. Anita Perez's mouth hung open in shock. A flight attendant near the galley gasped audibly. Desmond Rivas stopped mid-sentence on his phone call. The entire airplane seemed frozen in disbelief, waiting to see if this impossible quiet would last. And it did. Kevin, still cradled in the teenager's arms, let out a small sigh and closed his eyes. He was falling asleep. "How did you," Wilton whispered, staring at this mysterious young man who had accomplished what seemed impossible. His voice was filled with wonder and confusion. "Who are you?" The teenager smiled gently, still swaying Kevin in that precise rhythm. "My baby sister Sylvia had a really bad colic, sir. Took me months to figure out what actually worked. The angle matters, the pressure on the stomach matters, the vibration from humming matters." Wilton looked around the cabin and saw something that made his heart pound. Every single first-class passenger was staring at them, but not with annoyance anymore. With amazement, with gratitude, with something that looked like awe. But what shocked Wilton most, what made him truly pay attention to this young man who had just performed a miracle with his son, was what he noticed next. As the teenager shifted Kevin carefully back into Wilton's arms, making sure the baby stayed asleep through the transfer, his backpack slipped off his shoulder and fell open slightly. Wilton caught a glimpse of the contents, advanced calculus textbooks with worn covers and highlighted pages. Notebooks filled with differential equations and complex mathematical proofs, competition patches sewn onto the fabric, and an MIT application folder, dog-eared and clearly well-read. "Wait," Wilton said, his exhaustion replaced by curiosity. "Please, what's your name? Why are you on this flight?" The teenager looked directly at Wilton with an intensity that seemed far beyond his years. There was intelligence in his eyes, a depth of understanding that startled Wilton. "My name is Samuel Snow, sir. I'm 16 years old. I'm from Northside, Chicago, and I'm traveling to London to compete in the International Mathematics Competition Championship at the Royal Institution." Wilton felt his entire world shift in that moment. The person who had just saved his sanity, who had calmed his son when nothing else could, who had performed what felt like actual magic, wasn't some trained professional or experienced nanny or wealthy peer from his own world. He was a brilliant teenager from a working-class neighborhood, traveling in economy class, with a backpack held together by duct tape and dreams that clearly reached far beyond his circumstances. But as Samuel stood there in the aisle, first-class passengers still watching in stunned silence, Wilton had no idea that this chance encounter was about to reveal a story of sacrifice, community, and genius that would shake everything he thought he understood about the world. And neither of them knew that what happened next would challenge every assumption Wilton had ever made about worth, intelligence, talent, and what it truly means to recognize brilliance when it appears in unexpected places. Wilton Phillips was the 44-year-old CEO of Phillips Technologies, a company worth $18 billion that specialized in artificial intelligence and social platforms. He was traveling to London for a critical tech summit on AI ethics, one of the most important meetings of his career. His wife Karen was back in Chicago, hospitalized with complications from childbirth, which was why Wilton was alone with Kevin on this flight. He was a man who controlled boardrooms, influenced policy, and shaped the future of technology. But in this moment, sitting in seat 4B with his sleeping son and this extraordinary teenager standing before him, Wilton realized he was about to learn something that all his wealth and power could never have taught him. Listen, if you believe in the power of community and sacrifice, you need to subscribe right now. Because at the end of the story, I'm revealing the one thing that Samuel's community did that made all the difference. There's a reason 53 families came together, and when I show you the exact strategy they used at the end, you'll understand why this approach works when individual effort fails. Every bake sale, every car wash, every donated dollar was part of a plan that most people miss. So if you want to see the secret behind how working-class communities create miracles, subscribe now and stay until the end. Trust me, this lesson will change how you see possibilities. Samuel Snow had been sitting in seat 38C of economy class for the entire 3 hours, trying to focus on the differential equations homework in his notebook, trying to block out the sound of the screaming baby that echoed all the way from first class. But he couldn't concentrate. Not because of the noise, though, that was certainly loud enough to make studying impossible. He couldn't concentrate because he knew exactly what was happening to that baby. He recognized the specific pitch of those screams, the particular pattern of the crying, the way it never seemed to stop or even pause for breath. His baby sister Sylvia had cried exactly like that for the first 6 months of her life. Samuel had listened to the flight attendants walking back and forth, their voices worried and apologetic. He'd heard passengers in economy complaining, making jokes, placing bets on how long it would take before someone snapped. He'd heard all of it, and something inside him had been building for the past 20 minutes. A certainty, a knowing. He could help that baby, he knew he could. The techniques that had finally worked with Sylvia, the specific angle and pressure and rhythm that his mother had never been able to afford to learn from a specialist, the things he'd figured out through pure desperation and trial and error at 3 in the morning. Those things would work. But stepping into first class felt terrifying. Samuel knew what he looked like. He knew what people saw when they looked at him. A poor black kid from Northside Chicago with clothes that had been washed so many times the fabric was thin and faded. A backpack literally held together with duct tape because he couldn't afford a new one, and this one still technically functioned. Shoes that were clean but worn down at the heels. He knew that crossing that blue curtain meant entering a space that wasn't designed for him, wasn't meant for him, would actively reject him. But the baby was still screaming, and Samuel knew he could help. So he stood up, his hands already starting to shake, and walked down the aisle toward first class. The blue curtain that separated the two worlds felt heavier than it should have as he pushed through it. The difference was immediate and overwhelming. Leather seats instead of cloth, warm lighting instead of harsh fluorescent light, space between the rows, the smell of expensive cologne and wine, and every single person in first class turned to stare at him the moment he appeared. A woman in pearls and an outfit that probably cost more than his entire competition trip. The one he'd heard complaining earlier actually pulled back in her seat when she saw him. Her face showed open disgust, like he was something dirty that had wandered into her space. A businessman in a suit that screamed wealth looked up from his phone and muttered just loud enough for Samuel to hear, "What's he doing here?" A flight attendant near the galley started moving toward him, clearly preparing to escort him back to economy where he belonged. But Samuel kept walking. His hands trembled at his sides. His heart pounded so hard he could feel it in his throat. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, to retreat, to accept that this wasn't his place. But the baby was still crying. That specific, desperate sound that he knew meant pain and exhaustion, and a parent who had tried everything and failed. He stopped at seat 4B. The man holding the screaming baby looked utterly destroyed. His expensive suit was rumpled, his face was pale and drawn, his hands shook with exhaustion, his eyes were red-rimmed, like he might cry himself at any moment. This was a man at the absolute end of his rope. Samuel's voice came out quieter than he intended, but somehow it still cut through the noise. "Sir, excuse me, sir. May I try to help your son?" The entire first-class section seemed to freeze. Every conversation stopped. Every passenger turned to watch. The tension in the air was so thick Samuel could barely breathe through it. He saw the businessman's hand move toward the call button. He saw the flight attendant take another step closer. He saw the woman in pearls open her mouth to say something cruel. This was the moment where he would either be rejected, humiliated, maybe even removed from the flight, or the moment where someone would choose to see past what he looked like and trust what he could do. The man in seat 4B stared at Samuel for what felt like forever. His eyes moved from Samuel's face to his worn clothes to his duct-taped backpack. Samuel could see the war happening behind those eyes, desperation fighting against conditioning, need fighting against prejudice, the hope for help fighting against the lifetime of assumptions about who belongs where and who can be trusted with what. Then the man's shoulders sagged with surrender. His voice was barely a whisper, cracked with exhaustion and something that might have been hope. "Please." Samuel stepped closer to seat 4B, his movements careful and deliberate. He could feel every eye in first class watching him, judging him, waiting for him to fail. "May I hold him, sir?" he asked quietly. Wilton Phillips hesitated for just a moment, his arms tightening instinctively around his son. Samuel could see the doubt flickering across the man's face, the internal question that was probably screaming in his mind. Why should I trust this stranger, this kid, this person who doesn't belong here? But desperation won out over doubt. Wilton carefully, almost reluctantly, transferred Kevin into Samuel's arms. The moment Samuel felt the baby's weight against him, his entire body shifted into a mode he knew by heart. This wasn't guesswork. This wasn't luck. This was hundreds of nights of trial and error with Sylvia. Hundreds of times his mother had come home from her double shift to find him still awake, still trying to figure out what would finally make the crying stop. He positioned Kevin at a very specific angle against his chest, not quite upright, but not lying down either, exactly 45 degrees. His left hand supported the baby's head and neck. His right hand pressed gently but firmly against Kevin's belly, applying steady pressure in a circular pattern. Then Samuel began to sway, not randomly, not frantically, but with a precise rhythm, side to side, exactly like a metronome set to 60 beats per minute, the same tempo as a resting heartbeat. And he started to hum. Not a melody exactly, but a low vibration that came from deep in his chest, a sound that he could feel resonating through his rib cage into the baby pressed against him. Kevin's screaming continued for maybe 10 seconds, then 15. Samuel didn't stop. He didn't change what he was doing. He just kept the angle, kept the pressure, kept the rhythm, kept the vibration. He'd learned with Sylvia that consistency was everything. Babies needed to feel the pattern, needed to understand that it wasn't going to change, needed to trust that this new sensation was safe. At 30 seconds, Kevin's screams shifted to crying. Still loud, still distressed, but different. At 60 seconds, the crying became whimpering. At 75 seconds, the whimpering started to break up with small gasps for breath. And at 90 seconds exactly, complete and total silence fell over the entire first-class cabin like someone had pressed a mute button on reality itself. Kevin's tiny face, which had been bright red and scrunched up in agony for 3 straight hours, began to relax. The tension in his little body melted away. His eyes, which had been squeezed shut so tightly, slowly opened and focused on Samuel's face. The baby looked calm. Actually calm. His breathing evened out, became deep and steady. His tiny fists unclenched, and then, impossibly, incredibly, his eyes started to close again. Not in distress this time, in sleep. The cabin remained frozen in absolute silence. Samuel could hear his own heartbeat. He could hear the engines. He could hear someone 3 rows back breathing. But nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Anita Perez's mouth hung open in shock, her pearl necklace forgotten in her hand. Desmond Rivas had actually stood up slightly from his seat to see better, his phone call completely abandoned. A flight attendant near the galley had her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. And Wilton Phillips just stared, his face a mixture of exhaustion, relief, wonder, and complete confusion about what he had just witnessed. Samuel waited another full minute, making sure Kevin was truly asleep, before he carefully, so carefully, transferred the baby back into Wilton's arms. He kept the same angle, maintained the same gentle pressure, moved in slow motion so as not to disturb the miracle that had just occurred. Wilton took his son back with shaking hands, and Kevin stayed asleep, his little chest rising and falling peacefully, his face relaxed and content. Samuel stepped back, ready to return to economy class before anyone could question his presence further. He turned toward the blue curtain, his job done, his heart still pounding from the fear and adrenaline of the past few minutes. But as he moved, his backpack, which had been hanging loose on one shoulder, slipped. The duct tape holding the zipper closed finally gave way, and the contents spilled across the first-class floor in a scattered mess. Advanced calculus textbooks landed at Wilton's feet, their covers worn and pages marked with hundreds of colored tabs. Notebooks filled with differential equations and mathematical proofs fanned out across the aisle. Competition patches that had been sewn onto the fabric showed logos from math Olympiads and academic tournaments, and an MIT application folder, dog-eared and clearly read dozens of times, skidded to a stop right in front of Anita Perez's designer shoes. Samuel dropped to his knees immediately, his face burning with embarrassment, scrambling to gather everything back into his broken backpack. But before he could collect even half of it, Wilton's voice stopped him cold. "Wait." The word was quiet but commanding. "Please, don't go." Samuel froze, a calculus textbook in one hand, his heart sinking. This was it. This was the moment where he'd be questioned, maybe accused of something, definitely told he didn't belong. But when he looked up at Wilton Phillips, he didn't see anger or suspicion. he saw something else entirely. Curiosity. Intense, burning curiosity. "How did you do that?" Wilton asked, his voice filled with wonder. "And who are you?" Samuel slowly gathered his books and papers from the first-class floor, his hands still trembling, acutely aware that every passenger was watching his every move. When he finally looked up at Wilton Phillips, he found himself staring into eyes that held genuine curiosity rather than judgment. It was disorienting. "My baby sister Sylvia," Samuel began, his voice quiet but steady. "She had a really severe colic. It started when she was about 2 weeks old. My mom works double shifts at a grocery store and a cleaning service, so when Sylvia would start crying in the middle of the night, it was just me and my grandmother trying to figure out what to do." Wilton gestured to the empty seat beside him. "Please, sit down. Tell me more." Samuel hesitated. Sitting in first class felt wrong in a way he couldn't quite articulate. He could already hear the whispers starting and see the sideways glances from other passengers. Anita Perez was whispering furiously to the woman beside her, both of them staring at him with barely concealed disgust. Desmond Rivas had his phone out, probably texting someone about the inappropriate person who had invaded their space. But Wilton was still looking at him with that intense curiosity, and Kevin was still sleeping peacefully. And Samuel found himself sinking into the leather seat that probably cost more than his family's monthly rent. "The doctors told my mom that Sylvia needed to see a specialist," Samuel continued, his fingers nervously twisting the strap of his backpack. "But we don't have insurance that covers that kind of thing, and the copay alone would have been almost $400. So my mom just gave me the handout the doctor printed, and I read everything I could find online about colic. I tried everything. Different positions, different sounds, different pressures. It took me about 3 months to figure out the exact combination that worked. The angle, the rhythm, the vibration. It's all about making them feel safe, making them feel like they're back in the womb, where everything was warm and consistent and predictable." Wilton was studying Samuel with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "You figured that out on your own? At what, 13 years old?" 14, Samuel corrected quietly. "I'm 16 now." "And the books that fell out of your bag," Wilton said, glancing down at the calculus textbook Samuel was clutching. "Those aren't exactly typical reading material for a teenager. What are you doing on this flight? Where are you going?" Real quick, pause for just 5 seconds and drop a comment below. Tell me if you've ever had to be twice as brave just to enter a space where you felt you didn't belong. Share your story, because this community is built on people who refuse to be invisible. Where are you from, and what barrier did you have to cross? I read every comment. Samuel took a deep breath. This was always the hard part. Explaining without sounding like he was bragging. Explaining without making it seem like he thought he was special. "I'm traveling to London for the International Mathematics Competition Championship at the Royal Institution. My teacher, Mrs. Anderson, nominated me at the beginning of last year. I made it through the regional competitions, then the nationals. And somehow I got selected to represent the United States." He could see Wilton's eyebrows rise, see the shift in how the man was looking at him. But before Wilton could respond, Samuel kept talking because he needed to explain the rest, the part that mattered more than any competition ever could. "The thing is, the trip costs $8,000. Airfare, hotel, registration fees, everything. My mom doesn't have that kind of money. We barely have enough for rent and food most months. My grandmother lives with us and she's on a fixed income. My little sister needs formula and diapers. There was no way I could go." Samuel's voice got quieter, but somehow more powerful. "So my neighborhood, Northside Chicago, they decided to fundraise for me." The first-class cabin had gone completely silent. Even the whispers had stopped. Every passenger was listening now, though most of them were pretending not to. "It took 8 months," Samuel continued, his eyes fixed on his hands. "Mrs. Jenkins organized bake sales every Saturday at the community center. Mr. Rodriguez set up car washes at his auto shop every Sunday. The church held fundraising dinners. Kids in my building sold handmade bracelets. My grandmother Marlene, she donated her savings from 30 years of working at the post office. $3,000, everything she had." His voice cracked slightly. 53 families contributed something. Some of them gave $5, some gave $50, some gave more. Every single dollar came from people who work paycheck to paycheck, who struggle to pay their own bills, who sacrificed something they needed so that I could have this chance. Wilton was staring at Samuel like he was seeing him for the first time. Really seeing him. Not just a kid who calmed a baby, not just a math student, but a person carrying the weight of an entire community's hopes and dreams on his shoulders. "My mom walked me to the bus station yesterday morning," Samuel said, his eyes suddenly bright with unshed tears. "She had to leave early for her shift, but she walked me all the way there anyway. And before I got on the bus to the airport, she held my face in her hands and she said something I can't stop thinking about." He paused, swallowing hard against the emotion building in his throat. She said, "Baby, you're not just representing yourself. You're showing them what we're capable of." The silence in the first-class cabin was deafening. Samuel could see that even Anita Perez had stopped whispering. Even Desmond Rivas had put down his phone. The flight attendant who had been moving to escort Samuel back to economy was standing frozen in the aisle, her hand over her heart. "Every single person who gave money for this trip," Samuel continued, his voice barely above a whisper now, "they're watching me. They're waiting to see if I can do it. If I can prove that a kid from Northside Chicago belongs in a room with the smartest students from around the world. If I can show that brilliance doesn't only come from wealthy families and expensive prep schools. If I can make their sacrifice mean something." He finally looked up at Wilton, and there were tears running down his face that he didn't bother to wipe away. "I have to win. Not for me. For them. For everyone who believed in me. If I fail, I'm not just failing myself. I'm failing 53 families who couldn't afford to help but did anyway." Wilton Phillips sat perfectly still for a long moment. Samuel could see something shifting in the man's expression. The curiosity was still there, but it had been joined by something deeper. Respect, recognition, maybe even a kind of understanding. When Wilton finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful and measured. "I grew up in rural Pennsylvania," Wilton said quietly. "My father worked in a factory. We ate government cheese. I built my first computer from parts I found in a dumpster behind a repair shop. So when you talk about carrying your community's hopes, about feeling like you have to prove something, about understanding that your success isn't just about you." He paused, looking down at Kevin sleeping peacefully in his arms. "I understand that pressure. I remember exactly what that feels like." Samuel wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, embarrassed by his tears, but somehow relieved that someone understood. Wilton's expression shifted again, from respect to something that looked almost like determination. His eyes moved from Samuel's face to the broken backpack held together with duct tape, to the worn clothes, to the cheap shoes. Then back to Samuel's eyes. When he spoke next, his voice was firm and certain. "Samuel, how would you feel about earning some extra money while you're in London? If you're still watching, you're exactly the kind of person this channel was built for. People who believe in recognizing talent regardless of where it comes from. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what happens next, because this exact moment of choosing to see value in unexpected places shows up in every story I cover about underdogs who change the world. And the lesson Samuel teaches here about maintaining your priorities, even when opportunity appears, becomes even more important in the next story I'm releasing about a homeless teen who revolutionized computer programming." Samuel stared at Wilton Phillips, trying to process what the man had just asked. Extra money. The words hung in the air between them like something both impossibly tempting and potentially dangerous. "I don't understand, sir," Samuel said carefully. "What kind of work are you talking about?" Wilton glanced down at Kevin, still sleeping peacefully in his arms, then back to Samuel. "My wife Karen is in the hospital back in Chicago. Complications from childbirth. She's stable, but she can't travel, which means I'm handling this London trip alone with Kevin. I'm there for a critical summit on AI ethics with Phillips Technologies, 4 days of meetings, presentations, negotiations. I can't do that effectively while caring for a 6-month-old baby, especially one who, as you just witnessed, I apparently don't know how to comfort." He paused, his expression serious but open. I'd like to hire you to help me care for Kevin during the trip. $500 per day. 4 days total. Samuel's mind went completely blank for a moment, then immediately started calculating. $500 a day. 4 days. $2,000 total. $2,000. That was Sylvia's medical bills for the next 3 months. That was the leaking roof in their apartment that had been getting worse every time it rained. That was his mother being able to take a week off work, maybe even see a doctor about the cough she'd been ignoring. That was food that wasn't pasta and canned vegetables. That was the breathing room. That was survival. But then reality crashed back in, cold and harsh. Sir, I appreciate the offer. Really, I do. But I can't let anything distract from the competition. That's the whole reason I'm here. That's what 53 families sacrificed for. I can't take their money and then fail because I was busy working for you. Something shifted in Wilton's expression. If Samuel had impressed him before, this seemed to impress him even more. That's exactly the kind of thinking that tells me you're the right person for this, Wilton said quietly. Let me be clear about something. I'm not asking you to sacrifice your competition. I'm asking you to help me during the hours when you're not competing. Early mornings, evenings, times when you'd be resting anyway. I will personally ensure that your competition schedule takes absolute priority. If you have a practice session, you go. If you have a test, you go. If you need study time, you take it. Kevin and I will work around your needs, not the other way around. Samuel wanted to believe it, wanted to trust that it could actually work that way. But he'd learned early that promises from wealthy people often came with strings attached, with expectations that weren't mentioned up front, with conditions that only appeared later. Why me? He asked, his voice cautious. You could hire a professional nanny, someone with credentials and experience and references, someone who actually knows what they're doing. Because you just did something that 3 hours of my desperate attempts and a dozen flight attendants couldn't do, Wilton replied simply. Because you clearly have both the skill and the heart for this kind of work. And because, frankly, I trust you. I don't know why, but I do. He shifted Kevin slightly in his arms. My wife, Karen, she's the one who usually handles everything with the baby. I run a company. I make decisions that affect thousands of employees and millions of users. But when it comes to my own son, I'm completely out of my depth. I need help, Samuel, real help, and I'm willing to pay well for it. $2,000. Samuel thought about his mother's face when he could send money home, thought about Sylvia getting the medicine she needed, thought about maybe, just maybe, being able to contribute something back to the community that had given him everything. I have one condition, Samuel heard himself say, his voice shaking slightly. I fulfill my responsibilities to you only when my competition obligations allow. The moment there's a conflict, the competition wins. Every single time. No exceptions. Wilton didn't hesitate. Agreed. Completely and absolutely agreed. And I need you to promise that if I'm not doing a good enough job, if Kevin needs someone better, you'll tell me immediately and find someone else. I won't let a baby suffer because I'm trying to earn money. Wilton smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. You just keep proving why you're exactly the right person for this. Yes, I promise. They shook hands, Samuel's worn and calloused from years of helping his grandmother with yard work and repairs, Wilton smooth and manicured from a lifetime of boardrooms and luxury. The contrast between them was stark, but at that moment, it didn't seem to matter. This was a transaction, yes, but it was also something else, a recognition of value, a mutual agreement of respect. Samuel saw movement in his peripheral vision and glanced up to find Desmond Rivas watching them intently. His eyes narrowed, his expression calculating and cold. There was something in the way the businessman was staring that made Samuel's skin prickle with unease, like he was a problem that needed to be solved, like he was something that didn't belong and needed to be removed. But before Samuel could worry about it further, the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our descent into London Heathrow. Please return to your seats and prepare for landing. We should be on the ground in approximately 20 minutes. Samuel stood up quickly, suddenly remembering that he was supposed to be in economy class, not sitting in first class making business deals with billionaires. I should get back to my seat, sir. Wilton, the man corrected. Call me Wilton, and Samuel, thank you, for Kevin, for agreeing to help, for being exactly who you are. Samuel nodded, not trusting his voice, and made his way back through the blue curtain into economy class. As he sank into his seat, his heart was racing and his mind was spinning. In the span of less than an hour, his entire trip had transformed. He was still going to compete. He was still carrying his community's hopes, but now, somehow, impossibly, he also had a job. A real job that paid more money than he'd ever imagined earning. A job working for a billionaire. London was waiting below the clouds, and Samuel Snow had absolutely no idea what was about to happen next. The gleaming black Mercedes S-Class that met them at Heathrow Airport looked like something from a movie. Samuel had seen cars like this before, of course, but only in music videos or driving past his neighborhood on the way to somewhere better. He'd never imagined being inside one. The moment he slid into the back seat, every sense was overwhelmed. The leather was so soft it felt like butter. The engine was so quiet, he couldn't tell if it was running. The climate control adjusted automatically to some perfect temperature he didn't even know existed. There was a bottle of water waiting for him in a holder that seemed designed specifically for that bottle. Everything was smooth, silent, and expensive beyond his comprehension. Samuel sat perfectly still during the entire drive, afraid to touch anything, afraid to move wrong and somehow break something that probably cost more than his family's annual income. Wilton sat beside him with Kevin in a car seat that looked more advanced than the space shuttle, tapping on his phone and occasionally pointing out landmarks. Big Ben, the Thames, Parliament. Samuel nodded and tried to look interested, but mostly he was trying to process the fact that this was actually happening. The Bradford Hotel made the Mercedes look modest by comparison. The lobby had crystal chandeliers that probably weighed more than Samuel did. The floors were white marble, so polished he could see his reflection. There were actual columns holding up the ceiling, columns like in ancient Rome. People in expensive clothes moved through the space like they belonged there, like this was normal, like marble lobbies and crystal chandeliers were just regular features of everyday life. A woman in a crisp uniform handed Samuel a key card and directed him to the elevators. "The penthouse floor, sir, suite 2401. Sir. She'd called him sir. Samuel almost laughed but caught himself. The suite was larger than his family's entire apartment, actually larger. Samuel stood frozen in the doorway for a full minute, unable to make himself step inside. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Thames River, the view stretching for miles. A king bed dominated the room, covered in white sheets that looked so perfect they might never have been touched by human hands. The bathroom had marble counters and a tub big enough to swim in. And the minibar, when Samuel finally worked up the courage to look inside, contained items with price tags that made his stomach hurt. A candy bar for £12, a tiny bottle of water for £8, a package of nuts for £15. Samuel closed the minibar and sat carefully on the edge of the bed, his hands shaking. He pulled out his phone, the screen cracked from a drop 6 months ago that he'd never been able to afford to fix, and called home. His mother answered on the first ring. "Baby, are you there? Are you safe?" "I'm here, Mama," Samuel said, and his voice broke immediately. "I'm in London. I'm in this hotel room that's bigger than our whole apartment. There's a view of the river and the bed is huge, and Mama, I don't know what I'm doing here." He could hear his mother crying on the other end. Happy crying, he thought. Hopeful crying. "You're doing exactly what you're supposed to be doing, baby. You're showing them what you're capable of." His grandmother, Marlene's voice boomed in the background. "Tell that boy we're proud of him. Tell him to win that competition. Tell him to eat some good food while he's there." Samuel laughed and cried at the same time. "I will, Grandma. I promise." After he hung up, there was a knock on the door. Wilton stood in the hallway with Kevin and a room service menu. "Mind if we have dinner together? I figured we could talk about the schedule for the next few days." They sat at the small table by the window, and Samuel ordered the least expensive thing on the menu, a pasta dish that still cost £30. Wilton ordered without looking at prices, including extra food that he insisted Samuel share. As they ate, Wilton started talking, and Samuel found himself leaning forward to listen. "I grew up in rural Pennsylvania," Wilton said quietly. "My father worked in a factory making car parts. We lived in a trailer. I wore the same 3 shirts to school for 2 years straight because we couldn't afford more. I built my first computer from parts I found in a dumpster behind a repair shop. He paused, looking out at the London skyline. I recognize hunger when I see it, Samuel. Not for food, for proof. Proof that you belong. Proof that you're good enough. Proof that all the people who doubted you were wrong. I had it too. Samuel stared at this billionaire sitting across from him, trying to reconcile the story with the reality. But you made it. You built Phillips Technologies. You're worth billions. I am now, Wilton agreed, but I remember exactly what it feels like to walk into spaces that weren't designed for me, to feel like everyone is waiting for me to fail, to carry the weight of everyone who believed in me. He looked directly at Samuel. Let me tell you something important. You've already proved it. By being here. By earning your way to this competition. By having the courage to help a stranger's baby on a plane. You've already shown everyone what you're capable of. Samuel felt something shift inside his chest. Some tight knot of fear loosening just slightly. After Wilton left, Samuel unpacked his competition materials. Tomorrow, the real test began. The Royal Institution looked like a palace. Samuel stood outside the massive stone building, staring up at columns that had witnessed centuries of scientific breakthroughs, and felt his stomach twist into knots. This was where Michael Faraday had discovered electromagnetic induction, where scientists and mathematicians whose names were in textbooks had walked these same halls. And now Samuel Snow from Northside, Chicago, was supposed to compete here, supposed to prove he belonged in this space that seemed designed specifically to remind him that he didn't. Inside was even more overwhelming. Vaulted ceilings stretched 3 stories high. Oil paintings of famous scientists lined the walls, their eyes seeming to judge everyone who passed beneath them. The main competition hall had rows of individual desks, each one equipped with a lamp paper and space for personal materials. And everywhere, absolutely everywhere, were the other competitors, 147 students from 38 countries. Samuel could hear at least a dozen different languages being spoken. He could see designer clothes that probably cost more than his entire wardrobe combined. A boy from Russia, maybe 17 years old with sharp features and an intense expression, sat with an actual personal coach who was reviewing strategies in rapid Russian. A girl from Singapore, named May, was talking to another competitor about her 15 hours per week of private tutoring with a former MIT professor. Students from prestigious academies, Phillips Exeter, Stuyvesant, Shanghai International, clustered together comparing notes and discussing their preparation courses that had cost thousands of dollars. Samuel was wearing his best clothes, a button-down shirt that his mother had ironed carefully the night before he left, using the iron they'd bought at a garage sale 3 years ago. Slacks from a thrift store that almost fit right, shoes he'd polished until they looked almost new, and in his hands, a $12 scientific calculator he'd saved up for by tutoring neighborhood kids in math, and a spiral notebook with some pages torn out because he'd needed them for other homework. He found his assigned desk and sat down, acutely aware of the stares, the whispers that weren't quite quiet enough. A girl with a French accent leaned over to her friend and said something that included the words "scholarship student" in a tone that made it clear what she thought about that. A proctor walked by with the roster, stopped at Samuel's desk, looked at his name tag and said, "Samuel Snow," butchering his last name so badly it didn't even sound close. "Snow," Samuel corrected quietly, "like the weather." The proctor didn't apologize, just marked something on his clipboard and moved on. The first exam was advanced algebra and number theory, 3 hours, 50 problems ranging from moderately difficult to nearly impossible. Samuel picked up his pencil and began. Within 15 minutes, his hand was cramping. He was used to solving problems in his head, used to working through equations mentally while he rode the bus or washed dishes or watched Sylvia. Writing everything out formally, showing all his work the way the competition required, felt awkward and slow. His handwriting, never great to begin with, became messier as his hand tired. And the problems themselves were abstract in a way that felt deliberately alienating. Pure theory. Mathematical proofs that seemed designed to test whether students had been trained in specific methods by specific types of teachers. Samuel stared at a problem about polynomial functions, and felt panic rising in his chest. This wasn't how he thought about math. This wasn't how he solved problems. So he started translating. The polynomial function became a traffic pattern, cars moving through intersections at different rates. The number theory problem became a basketball trajectory, the arc of a shot determined by angle and force. The probability question became a budget distribution, his mother deciding which bills to pay with limited money. He turned every abstract concept into something real, something he could visualize and understand and solve using the methods that made sense to him. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't the formal approach they'd probably been taught at their expensive prep schools. But it worked. Samuel moved through the problems one by one, translating and solving, his hand aching, his confidence wavering, but his determination absolute. When time was called, Samuel set down his pencil with no idea whether he'd passed or failed. Around him, students were already comparing answers, discussing approaches, laughing about which problems had been easier than expected. Samuel packed up his materials and walked out into the London afternoon feeling hollow and uncertain. The results were posted at 6 p.m. on a board in the main hall. Samuel pushed through the crowd of competitors searching for his name. When he found it, his heart sank and soared at the same time. 12th place. Out of 147 competitors, not bad, actually pretty good, but not winning, not even close to winning. 9 competitors from various countries were ahead of him, and he could already hear some of them celebrating in multiple languages. Samuel walked back to the Bradford Hotel in a daze. When he entered Wilton's suite, Kevin saw him and broke into the biggest smile, reaching out his little hands. And somehow, holding that baby who didn't care about rankings or competitions or whether Samuel belonged in elite spaces, Samuel felt just a little bit of the fear loosen its grip. Tomorrow was day 2. Tomorrow he'd have to prove he belonged. Tomorrow he'd have to climb. Day 2 of the competition brought a different kind of challenge. Instead of individual testing, the competitors were randomly assigned to teams of 5 for a complex group problem. The announcement went up on the board at 9 a.m., and Samuel found himself grouped with Victor from Russia, May from Singapore, a boy named James from some private school in Connecticut, and a girl named Aisha from Dubai. They were given 3 hours to solve a multivariable optimization problem that made Samuel's head spin just reading it. Design an efficient public transportation network for a theoretical city of 2 million people with specific budget constraints, environmental considerations, and demographic distribution patterns. The 5 of them gathered around a large table in one of the competition rooms. Victor immediately pulled out a laptop with sophisticated modeling software. May started writing formal algorithms on the whiteboard. James, who had made it clear within the first 30 seconds that he'd attended Phillips Exeter Academy and scored a perfect 1600 on his SATs, began sketching theoretical graphs using advanced calculus. They were all speaking the same language, the language of formal mathematical training, expensive preparation courses, and academic rigor that Samuel had never been taught. Samuel sat quietly and listened, trying to follow their rapid discussion of optimal route algorithms and cost-benefit analysis matrices. They were smart, really smart, and they all seemed to understand exactly what approach to take, what formulas to apply, what theoretical models to use. Samuel felt the familiar weight of inadequacy settling over his shoulders. He was 12th place. These students were probably all ranked higher. They knew what they were doing. But as he listened, something started bothering him. They were treating the city like it was just numbers on paper. Like the people who would actually use this transportation system didn't matter. Like real life didn't matter. What if we used actual traffic pattern data from real cities with similar constraints? Samuel suggested quietly. Chicago has a system that deals with a lot of these same issues, and we could model our solution based on what actually works versus what theoretically should work. James didn't even look up from his calculations. This is mathematics, not social studies. We need rigor. We need proof. We can't just base our solution on anecdotal observations. Samuel felt his face heat up with embarrassment. But something in him pushed back against the dismissal. He quietly pulled out his notebook and started sketching while the others continued their theoretical debate. He drew the Chicago L train map from memory, every line and stop that he'd ridden hundreds of times. He overlaid the demographic data from his neighborhood, the patterns he'd memorized because they affected his life every single day. Where the factories were, where the schools were, where elderly people lived, where shift workers needed to get to at odd hours. He applied everything he knew from watching his mother plan her commute between 3 jobs. The way she had to leave an hour early because the bus routes didn't connect properly. The way shift changes at the hospitals and factories created surge demand that the system couldn't handle. The way school zones needed different scheduling. The way elderly mobility required closer stop spacing in certain areas. All the things that formal algorithms and theoretical models couldn't account for because they'd never lived it. While Victor and James debated mathematical proofs, Samuel built a solution that actually worked for real people. After an hour of watching the theoretical approach go nowhere, Aisha walked over to Samuel's side of the table and looked at his notebook. Her eyes widened as she studied his sketches and calculations. Wait, this is brilliant. You're accounting for time poverty, for shift schedules, for actual human behavior patterns that affect usage. She turned to the others. Everyone, look at this. They gathered around Samuel's notebook, and he talked them through his approach. How the roots needed to account for when people actually worked, not when theory said they should work. How budget constraints meant prioritizing high-density shift worker corridors over wealthy neighborhoods that had cars. How environmental considerations meant putting stops near existing community gathering points so people would actually use the system. May started nodding, running Samuel's numbers through her algorithms. The efficiency rating is actually higher than our theoretical model, and the cost is lower. Victor pulled up his modeling software and started inputting Samuel's framework. This works. This actually works better. They spent the next 2 hours refining Samuel's practical approach with their theoretical tools, combining his real-world understanding with their formal training. When time was called, their team had a complete solution that addressed every requirement of the problem. More than that, they had a solution that would actually function in reality, not just on paper. The judges announced results an hour later. Samuel's team finished first among all groups and scored the highest marks of the entire day. That evening, back at the Bradford Hotel, Samuel held Kevin and sang the same lullaby he sang to Sylvia back home. A soft melody about stars and dreams that his grandmother had taught him. Kevin's eyes drooped, and he fell asleep in Samuel's arms with complete trust. Samuel didn't notice Wilton standing in the doorway, watching with an expression of profound respect and something that looked almost like wonder. Day 3 brought the final challenge, and Samuel could barely breathe through the anxiety. The top 15 competitors would present solutions to a real-world problem in front of a panel of judges that included MIT professors, tech company CEOs, and United Nations policy advisors. The problem itself made Samuel's stomach twist with both fear and strange recognition. Create an algorithmic model to optimize resource distribution, specifically food, medicine, and education, in communities with systemic inequality. This was it. Everything came down to this moment. Samuel sat in the waiting area backstage, his hands shaking so badly he had to clench them into fists to make them stop. He watched on a monitor as other competitors presented their solutions. A student from Germany showcased a machine learning model that could predict resource needs with 92% accuracy. A girl from Japan presented a game theory approach using blockchain verification for transparent distribution. A boy from England demonstrated an AI system that could optimize delivery routes in real time based on changing demand. They were all technically brilliant, sophisticated, impressive in ways that made Samuel feel small and underprepared. Their presentations used terms he barely understood, referenced research papers he'd never read, displayed visualizations created with software he'd never touched. And the judges nodded and took notes and asked intelligent questions that showed they were engaging seriously with each proposal. Samuel was second to last. When his name was called, he walked onto the stage feeling like he might throw up. The auditorium was massive, filled with hundreds of people. The judges sat in the front row, their faces serious and evaluating. He could see Wilton in the audience, Kevin sleeping peacefully in his arms, and that small sight gave Samuel just enough courage to begin. He didn't start with his model. He didn't start with algorithms or data or theoretical frameworks. He started with the truth. When my sister Sylvia was born with colic, my mother couldn't afford the specialist the doctor recommended, Samuel said, his voice quiet but steady. She worked 16-hour days between 2 jobs, but she still couldn't access the medical care that was only 3 miles away because the bus routes didn't serve our neighborhood. I watched her sit at our kitchen table and calculate. If she took time off for the appointment, we couldn't pay rent. If we couldn't pay rent, we'd be evicted. That's not a math problem you find in textbooks. That's the equation that thousands of families in poor communities solve every single day. The room had gone completely silent. Samuel could feel every eye on him, but he kept talking, because this was the only chance he'd ever have to say what needed to be said. Most resource distribution models prioritize based on population density, Samuel continued, pulling up his presentation on the screen behind him. They assume that more people equals more need, but that's not how poverty actually works. My model prioritizes distribution based on 3 variables that traditional systems ignore. First, mobility access. How far can people actually travel given their work schedules, their childcare responsibilities, their physical limitations? Second, time poverty. How many hours per day do they have available after accounting for multiple jobs, long commutes, and caretaking duties? Third, trust networks. Do they trust the institutions offering help, or have those institutions failed them so many times that they'd rather go without than engage? He walked the judges through his algorithm, showing how it would have gotten Sylvia the medical care she needed by placing a community health clinic within walking distance of his neighborhood instead of 3 miles away in a location that required 2 bus transfers. How it would have saved his mother 4 hours by scheduling services during evening hours when shift workers were available instead of only during business hours when wealthy people could attend. How it would have cost the system less money by preventing emergency room visits that happened because preventive care was inaccessible. Samuel's voice cracked slightly as he explained how top-down systems fail because they don't account for the way poor communities actually operate. Through informal support networks where neighbors share resources, through time-based barriers where every hour matters because missing work means missing rent, through institutional distrust built from generations of promises that were never kept. These aren't soft variables, Samuel said, his hands no longer shaking because he was finally speaking his truth. These are data points that privileged researchers miss because they've never had to live them. My so-called disadvantages, my experience with scarcity and struggle, that's not a deficit in my education. It's a unique data set that reveals what formal algorithms can't see. When he finished, the room was silent for what felt like an eternity. Then, Dr. Patricia Chen from MIT stood up from the judges' panel and started clapping. Slowly, one by one, the other judges joined her. Then, the audience. Victor, the Russian competitor who'd been first place all 3 days, was nodding with clear respect. Even James from Connecticut looked impressed. Samuel walked off the stage in a daze and collapsed into a chair backstage, emotionally drained in a way that had nothing to do with tiredness. He'd just exposed every painful part of his life to hundreds of strangers. He'd turned his trauma into a presentation. He'd made his mother's suffering into an algorithm. And he had no idea if it had been enough. Wilton found him 20 minutes later, Kevin still sleeping in his arms. He sat down beside Samuel without saying anything for a moment. Then, quietly, he spoke. Whatever happens next, you just changed how a room full of the most powerful people in technology and policy see the world. That's the real victory, Samuel. That's what matters. The awards ceremony took place in the Royal Institution's Grand Hall on the evening of the 3rd day. Samuel sat in a velvet chair that felt too fancy for someone like him, wedged between Wilton, who was holding a sleeping Kevin, and Mai from Singapore, who kept nervously adjusting her dress. The entire room buzzed with tension and anticipation. 147 competitors had started this journey. Only 15 had made it to the final presentations, and now only 3 would stand on that stage and receive medals. The announcer, A distinguished-looking man with silver hair and a British accent that sounded like it came from a movie stepped up to the microphone. Third place, with an exceptional demonstration of technical innovation and creative problem-solving, Mei Chen from Singapore. The room erupted in applause. Mei stood up, tears already streaming down her face, and walked to the stage to receive her bronze medal and certificate. Samuel's heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. Second place, first place. Those were the only spots left. He thought about his mother working her double shift right now, probably checking her phone every 5 minutes hoping for news. He thought about his grandmother Marlene, who had given away 30 years of savings. He thought about 53 families who had scraped together money they didn't have. He thought about Mrs. Anderson, who had believed in him when he didn't believe in himself. Second place, the announcer continued, with a masterful display of mathematical precision and algorithmic elegance, Viktor Petrov from Russia. More applause. Viktor stood, shook hands with his coach, and walked to the stage with the confidence of someone who had expected to place. He received his silver medal with grace, but Samuel could see the disappointment in his eyes. Second place when you expected first was still a loss. That meant either Samuel had won or he hadn't placed at all. There was no in-between. The announcer paused for what felt like an eternity, letting the tension build in the room. Samuel couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but sit there and wait for his entire world to either transform or collapse. And first place, the announcer said, his voice carrying across the silent hall, with a groundbreaking presentation that redefined how we approach algorithmic justice and challenged every judge to reconsider their assumptions about problem-solving, Samuel Snow from Chicago, United States. The room exploded. People were standing, clapping, some of them cheering. Samuel sat frozen, unable to process what he'd just heard. Wilton grabbed his shoulder and squeezed, saying something Samuel couldn't hear over the roaring in his ears. Mei was hugging him. Other competitors were reaching over to shake his hand. And slowly, like he was moving through water, Samuel stood up and walked toward the stage. His legs felt like they might give out. His vision was blurry with tears he hadn't realized were falling. He climbed the stairs to the stage and stood there as the announcer placed a gold medal around his neck and handed him a trophy that was heavier than he expected. Then came the envelope, the official letter on MIT letterhead confirming his full scholarship. $250,000 over 4 years. A full ride. Everything he'd ever dreamed of. Samuel looked out at the audience and saw Wilton holding Kevin, both of them watching him with expressions that made his chest hurt with gratitude. He saw competitors who had doubted him now applauding him. He saw judges who had listened to his truth and chosen to believe it mattered. And he allowed himself to cry, right there on stage in front of hundreds of people, because he'd done it. He'd actually done it. When they handed him the microphone for his acceptance speech, Samuel's voice broke on the first word. "This isn't my victory alone," he managed to say. "This belongs to everyone who believed a kid from Northside Chicago could do this. To my mom, who showed me what real problem-solving looks like by living it every single day. To my grandmother, who gave away everything she had. To my community, 53 families who funded a dream they didn't have to fund. To Mrs. Anderson, who saw something in me I couldn't see. And to Mr. Phillips, who saw my value when I couldn't see it myself." Later that evening, at a private dinner in Wilton's hotel suite after Kevin had been put to bed, Wilton made Samuel an offer that changed everything again. "In 6 years, when you graduate from MIT, I want you to join Phillips Technologies, not as an employee, as a partner. I'm creating a new division focused on using AI and mathematics to solve social inequality. You'll lead it. You'll have resources, autonomy, a platform to actually implement the kind of solutions you presented today. Because you see problems I never could, and solutions I never would." Samuel stared at this billionaire, who had become something much more than an employer over the past 4 days. "Why?" he asked quietly. "Why me?" "Because 3 days ago, you stepped across a curtain you weren't supposed to cross to help a stranger's baby," Wilton said simply. "Because you carry your community with you instead of trying to escape it. Because your genius comes from your experiences, not despite them. Because the world needs people like you making decisions that affect people like you. They shook hands across the table, not as CEO and student, but as equals planning a future together. The flight home felt surreal. Samuel sat in first class this time, a ticket Wilton had upgraded as a gift, with Kevin sleeping peacefully in his arms, the same baby whose screams had started this entire impossible journey. The trophy sat in the seat beside him, gold and heavy and real. Samuel pulled out his phone and typed a message to his mother with one hand, the other still supporting Kevin. "We did it, Mama. First place, full scholarship to MIT. And Mom, everything's about to change." 3 dots appeared immediately, showing she was typing. Then her response came through. "Baby, everything has already changed. The moment you were brave enough to help. I love you so much." Samuel looked down at Kevin, peaceful and trusting in his arms, and thought about how the smallest acts of kindness could create ripples that changed everything. How crossing a curtain could lead to crossing into an entirely different life. How the boy who had comforted a crying baby was now going to help comfort entire communities. The circle was complete, but it wasn't ending. It was just beginning. Now, here's what I promised you at the beginning. The secret that made Samuel's community fundraising work when individual effort would have failed. It wasn't just about raising money. It was about creating collective investment, about making 53 families stakeholders in Samuel's success. When communities pool resources, they create accountability, support networks, and shared pride that multiplies the impact of every dollar. That's why Samuel felt the weight of expectation but also the power of belief. That's the model that works. If this story moved you, click the video on your screen right now to see 3 other stories about underestimated geniuses who changed their fields, the moments of recognition that transformed their lives, and the one pattern that appears in every breakthrough. You'll see how a janitor became a groundbreaking mathematician, how a homeless girl revolutionized medical research, and the exact moment when the world finally saw their value. These stories will change how you see potential in yourself and others. And before you go, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss stories like this. Because the world is full of Samuel Snows, brilliant people waiting for someone to see past their circumstances and recognize their genius. Let's make sure their stories get told. I'll see you in the next one.